afternoon. It's Dave Norton from Discovering New England History, and we're going to continue on with part 4 of the Great Locomotive Chase, which is actually the story of Private Robert Buffum, who actually won the Congressional Medal of Honor for his part in this Great Locomotive Chase, which happened out in Chattanooga, Tennessee, and Atlanta, Georgia, in that area. So we'll go to the next slide. And from the last episode, we're just going to recap a little bit. The general, which is Locomotive, which they stole, was heading straight towards the Resaca-covered bridge in Georgia. There's an actual picture in the Civil War of that bridge. You can see the pilings there, you can see the river, and a lot of the bridges in the South, they were actually covered like this. So here it was going full blast through the Resaca-covered bridge, which is one of the bridges, or the bridge that they wanted to actually burn down. So we'll go to the next slide. And that was a great picture there. They uncoupled the last of the 3 boxcars, and they had all the railroad pilings inside the boxcar, and what they did is they lit it on fire, and they uncoupled it and left it inside the covered bridge. Of course, they're being chased by the Confederates in the locomotive, the Texas. And this is a great depiction, a great picture of that over there. It shows the general here. And if you take a look there, there's between where the covered bridge is and the fire, there's quite a few of the raiders running on the trestle before they get into the tender car. And probably Robert Buffum was there doing this activity there, because he was one of the raiders involved in all of this. Unfortunately, it had rained and rained and rained, and the ties that they pulled up were soaking wet. So basically all it did was kind of smolder in the tunnel. So we'll go to the next slide. And this is a great picture that I recently found. There's the Sakura Bridge today. And you can see the pilings are still there. Well, what actually happened was they uncoupled the boxcar, left it in flames, got back and headed to General North again. And the Texas was following. Of course, the Texas was following. It couldn't turn around, so it was following backwards, running the train backwards, which was perfect because they just coupled onto this, pushed it out of the bridge before it could catch fire, and continued on. But that's a great picture there showing exactly where this happened in Resaca, Georgia. And we'll go to the next slide. So here's the general heading north, and you can see our map over here. We started down the bottom of Atlanta, and the general's all the way coming up here, and we're going to hit the next final 3 stops here at the top of the map right here. So the general's now steaming north, trying to get away from the Texas. And we'll go to the next slide. And they went through, we mentioned this in the last episode, the Dalton Depot. This is really important because now they went right through the depot, kept on going, didn't stop, but the Texas was right behind them. And the Texas let off a telephone operator that they had on their train. And he dashed and ran through the doors right here and went to the telegraph key to try to send a message up to the Chattanooga to alert the Confederate Army of what was taking place here. And he started doing the telegraph key on the message here. And then the Texas continued the pursuit of the locomotive, the general. So we'll go to the next slide. There's a picture that's Ed Henderson. That's the only picture that we have. And he actually they didn't have a chance to really cut down the telegraph lines because they're going so fast, and the Texas was gaining on the general. So the telephone line was open, and it got through halfway through, almost 2/3 through the message, and then the raiders cut the line. But it was enough to alert General Ledbetter, which is he's a picture there on the right. And an interesting story here, believe it or not, he graduated 3rd in his class of West Point, and he was born in Leeds, Maine, if you can believe that. So here's another New England story, but he had really wanted to join the South, so he didn't join the Union Army. He became a general in the Confederate Army. So we'll go to the next slide. Now, the Confederate Army was alerted in Chattanooga, and that's a great picture right there. You can see there's the train right there. They've got all the rebel soldiers. They're all on alert because they wanted to get the spies that stole their train, the general. That's a great picture right there. And we'll go to the next slide. And this is good. Now they're steaming head north, and they approach what is called Tunnel Hill. It was a tunnel. Back in 1862, this was quite a engineering achievement to put a tunnel through a mountain, 1,500 feet long. And now here's the locomotives. They're chasing each other, and they're going 65 miles an hour. On the left is the actual picture taken in the Civil War of the opening going through the tunnel. And on the right is what it is today. And you can see all the original tracks were pulled up, and now it's a sort of a bike path, if you will, or a place for people to walk through the tunnel from one end to the other. And we'll go to the next slide. And I like this picture here. This is the race through the tunnel, 65 miles an hour. And I put them in relative position. Now you can see the general on the right heading north, and the Texas, which was running backwards at 65 miles an hour because there was no place for them to actually turn around, chasing it. And of course the general was trying to gain on them, and they really couldn't stop now to rip up tracks or do anything like that. And Texas kept on gaining and gaining and gaining. So we'll go to the next slide. And this is a great picture. It looks like today. It's a 1,500 foot long tunnel. And Fuller was the conductor on the Texas, and he was determined to get these spies, to get these raiders that stole his train. I remember he was the original conductor of the train that the spies stole down in Georgia. We'll go to the next slide. And there's a picture of the general speeding toward the next depot, the Ringgold Depot. And we'll go to the next slide. Now, here's actually a picture taken today. And that's the Ringgold Depot. So here's the Texas, and they're going after the general, 65 miles an hour. The distance was probably 2 or 3 football fields between the locomotives at this point. The problem you have now is the general, when it stopped, one stop to take on wood and to take on water, couldn't take on everything they wanted. They only could fill the boiler maybe 2/3. They could only take 2/3 of the wood. And they really didn't have, it was interesting because they really didn't have enough resources here to keep this engine powered. So we'll go to the next slide. And I like this picture. I took that when I was down in Ringgold, Georgia. There's my wife sitting there in a doorway, and you can see the town is saving this because it's an important part of their history. You do a lot with preservation. So you can see the stone building. You can see how they patched it all up with concrete, and it's actually quite a nice tourist attraction right now. So we'll go to the next slide. Now, 2 miles north of Ringgold, here's the actual track right here, the generals started slowing down. They were losing steam. They were doing anything they could to they had no more wood to throw in there. So now James Andrews knew this was getting near the end. So go to the next slide. So there it is. It just stopped dead in the middle of the tracks. And the last thing James Andrews said to all the raiders was, jump off and scatter, every man for himself. And that's what they did. And when I was down in Georgia, on the right there, that's a picture there that I took. That's the picture of the general, and signifies the exact spot where the train had to stop. So we'll go to the next slide. Now, when the group split up, of course, there were quite a few raiders on the train, over 16, and these four knew each other, so they decided they were going to band together and make it out through the woods. So this, I did the research. This is Robert Buffum's escape group. Daniel Dorsey, William Benzinger, and George Wilson, along with Robert Buffum. They pretty much stayed together and made off into the Georgia woods. And of course, the Confederate Army was alerted, and now they had cavalry. They had everybody combing the woods to try to catch all these spies, since they didn't wear any uniforms. So we'll go to the next slide. Now, one group of spies was caught just outside of Ringgold in they describe it as just a shack. So here's a picture taken in 1862. I really can't say that's exact shack, but what they did was all the Confederates surrounded the shack, and they captured one group of raiders. And this fellow here, Jacob Parrott, he was selected because he was the youngest. I think he was only 17 or 18 years old at the time, and he looked like the weakest of the raiders. So the colonel in the Confederate Army had him in front of all the others at this cabin outside, and what he did was he stripped off all the top of his clothes down to his waist, had him stand on the porch there, and gave him 100 lashes. And the idea was he screamed at him, and what he wanted to do was say, who was the engineer of the general? And this young fella here would not give it away, because they wanted the engineer, and he was going to actually hang them right there on the spot. But he wouldn't tell which one of the raiders was the engineer. And they said he gave him the first 33 lashes, then he would stop and give him another chance to tell, and he wouldn't tell. He gave him another 33, and he'd stop again and gave him another 33. And then what happened was another Confederate officer came by and stopped the whole thing right in process there. He said, no, these folks captured, we have to put them to trial. And he stopped it right there. So we'll go to the next slide. So all 19 raiders were captured that were on the train in different groups, different areas all around Georgia, northern Georgia, and around Chattanooga, Tennessee. And it took them 12 days. They rounded them all up. And General Ledbetter right there, who's originally from Leeds, Maine, he's the one at a time, they came to his headquarters, and he interrogated them. And Robert Buffum was, of course, from Salem, Massachusetts, and he was also interrogated during this process. And that's a picture in the middle of what Chattanooga looked like in 1862. So we'll go to the next slide. Now, what happened was, we mentioned Union Army General Mitchell. He was approaching Chattanooga. Now, the rebels were afraid that we better do something here. Now we've got the raiders here. We don't want the Union Army to to free these raiders. So what they did is they put them on a train. You can see the train there on the left, on one of the passenger cars under heavy guard. And they sent them back down the line towards Atlanta. And they stopped at actually the same place where they started, down in Marietta, Georgia. And there's a picture there of where they stopped, and they held them there. So we'll go to the next slide. Then things kind of cooled down a little bit. The rebels reinforced Chattanooga, and the Union Army didn't really take over the city at that point. So they sent all 19 back up the line again to Chattanooga, to the jail. It's called the Swims Jail. And there's James Andrews, who's the head of the Raiders, and of course, Private Buffum and that's the only picture of what this jail was. That was a terrible place to be in captivity. So we'll go to the next slide. Now, what it was they took 19 of the raiders and held them down in the cellar. And they had just two small, I won't call them windows, but they're almost like open air vents. That's how small they were on each side of this. And everything was, there's no light, pitch dark, dirt floor, 13 feet high by 13 feet by 13 feet. And that's where they kept them. The only way down was a ladder, which they lowered down into this, I call it a dungeon. And they took all the raiders, you can see the picture there, they chained them all, they put leg irons on both legs, chained together. And then they took 2 by 2 and they put shackles 2 by 2 around each man's neck. And he was chained around the neck to the next person right next to him. And that's how they had it. And this place was, the description of this place was just amazing. I mean, without going into too much detail, the cellar was crawling with rats and mice. And since each one of these they were chained and padlocked one neck to the other. If you moved, you had to move with your buddy. And because they put the irons on so tight and it was so cumbersome, you couldn't really flick off anything. And it was all kinds of vermin were crawling and everything else. And the only way they had the food, the Confederates, they lowered the ladder and they brought the ladder back up. And what they would do is they would take a wooden bucket on a rope, drop it down the trap door in the ceiling, kind of swing it around a little bit, and then all the raiders would try to get close to it and take the food. Any meager rations, rancid meat and whatever, only 2 meals a day. And the Confederates were basically taunting the prisoners, saying, look, you see the rope here hanging, going from side to side, that's what's going to happen to you in a few days. So that's a description of the captivity that they went into. They were down in this cellar for 3 weeks, not knowing if at any moment that the Confederates would come down, take them out, and hang them. So we'll go to the next slide. Now, Robert Buffum from Massachusetts there, we told in the original type of the program, he loved Shakespeare. He quoted this verse. Some of the survivors at a great locomotive chase said he quoted this verse from Shakespeare's Hamlet. So I'm going to read this to you there, and it adequately describes or tries to describe how bad it was in their captivity. So here's a quote. But that I am forbid to tell the secrets of my prison house. I could a tale unfold whose lightest word would harrow up thy soul and freeze thy young blood. And they would break the monotony by Robert Buffum was quite a very special person. He would recite Shakespeare, he would tell stories, anything to keep the morale of the group up. And a lot of people don't know that, so that's quite a Massachusetts and New England story. So we'll go to the next slide. Now, they took 12, there were 19 in the cellar, and they took 12 of them and they sent them 100 miles northeast to Knoxville for trial. And they wanted to separate them, so part of them stayed in Swim's jail, and these 12 were sent by armed train to Knoxville, and Robert Buffum was sent there. And on the right, that's a depiction of the courthouse where they had a trial, and on the left, there's a sort of depiction of one raider at a time was tried. You can see the Confederate officers there. So they went through this proceedings, and they only got through with the sentencing of 7 of the 12 raiders, because all of a sudden the Union Army was getting close to Knoxville. So now they had to do something with the prisoners again. So we'll go to the next slide. So back they go. So they're all back to Swim's jail in Chattanooga. There's James Andrews. And one day they took Andrews out all by himself, and they said, "You're the first one that's going to hang as a spy." And they formally charged him, and he went back down and told the others what was going to happen. And so they decided that because they were all chained up, there's no way all of us can try to escape. The only way we can do it is we can all sort of get together and free James Andrews, let him try to escape, because he knew he was going to die the next day. So what they did is they coerced the guard to come down the ladder, overpowered the guard. They had no time for everybody to unshackle everything around their necks and on their legs. They said, "But at least we want to get James Andrews out of here, and maybe worry about ourselves later." So they did. They unshackled him. He went up through got the ladder up through the trap door and head out into the country. And incredible story. We'll go to the next slide. And what he did is he came up. Now he was on foot. He hadn't eaten very well, lost a lot of weight. There were all cuts around his arms and his legs where he was shackled. They were just cut raw. And then he came up to the Tennessee River in Chattanooga. And he felt the only place he could survive there is if he swam across the Tennessee River to this island called Williams Island. And so he took his shoes off, tied them up, put them around his neck. Tired as he was, weak as he swam all the way across the Tennessee River to the island. Finally, he got to the cabin on the island, and it looked like they were friendly people. I said, oh my gosh, that this fellow is really, really destitute. So they took him in his house. He said, what I want is a warm place to sleep and some food, and I'll be on my way. So they gave him a nice big supper. They took care of him and all of that, and he was going to be on his way. But then you can see what happened. We'll go to the next slide. They immediately, once he was well and he's kind of squared away after a couple of days, they notified the rebel army and they captured him in the cabin. And they took him back to the jail, Swim's jail. And this time they really shackled him. So now there they are back in the jail. There's another picture in the bottom right corner. There he is. And he was really despondent. The rest of the group there, that was their leader. He was very tall, about 6'3", 6'4". They looked up to him, and he just at that point there, he was very down. We'll go to the next slide. Now, what they did is they took those 19 raiders. Now, once again, the Union Army made another push towards Chattanooga, so they had to get them out of there under armed train, sent them south again, all the way down, back all the way down the line, to Atlanta, Georgia, to the Fulton County Jail, which was another terrible jail to be confined in. So we'll go to the next slide. And there's a marker there. This time, they didn't wait. They didn't take James Andrews and put him in the jail. As soon as the train stopped, they got out. They went down a couple of streets. They already had the gallows set up there. And that's the sign there today in Atlanta, Georgia. And they strung them up and hanged them right there in front of all the other raiders. Then they took the other raiders and they confined them all back down in this new Fulton jail. So we'll go to the next slide. And there they are. Now, 7 of those raiders were actually tried back in Knoxville and convicted of being spying, okay? So those 7, only the 7 that were actually tried before they moved them down from Knoxville all the way down to Atlanta, they were all sentenced to hang. And they actually hanged them. And that's go back to that picture again. You can see. So they took those 7 out. And that's a picture there. They each had something to say, and they hanged them all right down there in Atlanta. And we'll go to the next slide. And those are the 7 raiders. They were hanged actually 11 or 12 days after their leader, James Andrews, was hanged. And those are the raiders. They're all boys were from Ohio, in Ohio. And of course, Buffum was the one that joined the Ohio regiment. And John Scott there over on the bottom right, He was the one they used to scramble up the telephone poles to cut the telegraph wires all the time. So we'll go to the next slide. Now there's 8 raiders left in jail. And they all escaped. They overpowered the guard. They said that we've got nothing to lose. We're going to get out of here. So these 8 raiders actually made an escape. And what happened here was Buffum and several of the raiders said, look, you 8 go out first. We're going to stay here and unlock the rest of the jails because there's other soldiers in here, Union soldiers. We want to have them go too. We don't want to just have us leave. So he was very, very noble and courageous, and he unlocked all, but unfortunately, the time he took to unlock all the rest, these 8 escaped, and he was captured again. So we'll go to the next slide. So Buffum plus 5 raiders never made it out on the escape attempt, and they were returned to the Fulton County Jail. And we'll go to the next slide. And Wilson and Wood escaped, and they made it down. They said, we're not going to go north, we're going to go south. And they stole a small raft, and they went all the way down the Chattahoochee River to try to escape. Some of these escape stories were really incredible. And what they did is they slept during the day and they rode at night. So we'll go to the next slide. And they went down you can see the river there. They went paddled down at night by this huge Confederate stronghold of Columbus, Georgia. Went right through there. And we'll go to the next slide. And they made it all the way down, and we were picked up by Union gunboat in the Gulf of Mexico. That's a picture of the gunboat. And it was that trip from Atlanta and the jail that they escaped to all the way to the Gulf of Mexico was 400 miles. And they made it and rejoined the Union Army. So we're going to continue on this story in episode 5, the escape attempts and actually what happened. It's a fascinating story of our friend here, Robert Buffum from Salem, Massachusetts. So once again, Dave Norton from Discovering New England History. Have a good afternoon.